welcome to the Mad Ones. I'm your host, who is the only Christian TikTok creator that's ever used a yo-yo in a video ever. And joining me today as my esteemed co-host and question askers that I miss are Zachary has never touched a yo-yo Cooper and the smartest Damon farmer I've ever met, our good friend Whip. How you boys doing?
Hello. Excellent. Thank you, brother.
I'm not a yo-yo master at all.
Yeah, that's not how people know you in any way. Such a random but fun thing about Coop is most of the videos that he got kind of bigger on TikTok was him spitting out apologetics while doing yo-yo tricks.
When I first got started, I was like, I don't think I could do that, and I'd make fun little trick videos with maybe some like religious songs in the background, and they kind of were like, eh. But then one day I just decided I'm going to talk about how AD means Anno Domini, and I'm going to throw a yo-yo around, and I'm just going to keep doing it until I get it right. And it worked.
Well, welcome back, boys. Thank you for joining me to fill the little
You
gaps I don't fill. Do you have a yo-yo story, Will?
A little. No, but well, maybe I guess actually technically, the Smothers Brothers actually got their start as a side, like a small tent next to Billy Graham. It was a yo-yo tent right next to the Billy Graham revival. It's a yo-yo revival, really. It's how the Smothers Brothers got their start.
Huh. Well, I'm stoked as every week about speaking with our guest. This is actually a return guest, so I'm thrilled about that. Last time this guest was on, I had read one of his books. Now since that time I've read 8 more, so I know a little. I know a little bit more about his voice and his thoughts. But before we get to that, this show is 100% brought to you by fans and patrons. So hit like, subscribe, share the show with your friends. We've covered all sorts of topics. So share them with someone who might gain something from them. Also, if you want to support me, if you want to support the show, you can go to Patreon for the occasional early episode, Zoom hangout, and my eternal gratitude. So patreon.com/themadOnes. Also, when I was doing the art for this episode, I created a new design that I made for a shirt, which is the slain lamb from Revelation 5, which I can't talk enough about that image, but we'll do that at another time. But if you go to wearethemadOnes.com/store, you can get a shirt, you can get a mug. If you go to wearethemadOnes.com/Christmas, it'll take you directly to all our Christmas stuff. But that's it. No more. I won't say any more about that. But joining us again tonight is a man who may somehow be more prolific than NT. Right. Last time he pushed back against that, but I'm holding to my guns on this one. The dude writes a lot. He's written the Chronicles of the Nephilim, the Chronicles of the Watchers, the Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and a lot of appendices, as well as companion theological books to go with the stories that he has written. He is writing about some of the most interesting things in the world to me, and I'm glad to have him back. Please welcome to the show once again, Mr. Brian Godawa.
Hello, people. Thank you.
I've read 8 more, Brian.
That's impressive, dude. I really seriously, I'm honored. Actually, I'm honored.
So what's funny is I think I read yesterday. While I was working, I'm able to read and listen, kind of go back and forth, and I read 75% of Caleb. Vigilant, is that I can't remember.
Yeah, that's a hard.
Allegiant.
Yeah, Vigilant.
Yeah.
No. Joshua Valiant, Caleb Vigilant. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So now I'm on. Is there one? No.
Jezebel's after that.
Yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. And so I'm in the middle of
David. David's
I read
after
David.
that.
I guess it was yesterday where I read most of David. That's what I meant. David Ascendant. But no, I want to say first off, I don't want to ruin the books for people who haven't read them. But when you brought in Ittai the Gittite, that is one of my favorite characters, because throughout the series up until that point, that was the question in my head, is the question he was asking of David. So thank you for that character, because it answered a question I had in my head about what you thought. So, like I said, he's good stuff. there you can find all of his books on Amazon. I think they're still all free if you have Kindle Unlimited.
Yeah.
I've been reading those, doing the reading portion for free, but they're also on Audible, and he reads all of them. He does all the voices, and if you didn't know how to pronounce stuff, it's a good way to do it because you're going to be able to pronounce it, even though you may not be able to spell it. So that's an awesome thing. Even though I think I like the pronunciation of Baal better than Baal.
Yeah, but they're both they both have scholarly backgrounds. I actually just chose Baal because it's easier to say than Baal.
Yeah.
But I've often wondered, like, should I have gone with the Baal one because it is a unique, that guttural sound, So, but once I had chosen it, by the time I started reconsidering it, it's like it's too late. I say Baal in like 3 or 4 of the novels, so it's like I got to keep going. So, but I have great respect for the pronunciation Baal.
Yeah, the first person I heard say it like that was Tim Mackey, who I love, and since then I've been like, I love that pronunciation. I shouldn't love the pronunciation of a false god, but I do. I love that pronunciation. It just makes it. It's like when people will say the Satan rather than just Satan. I also respect that. So it's minuscule, nitpicky stuff, but I just love that precision.
I appreciate
but
that.
I also, I remembered the word that I which I've now forgotten. I think it's Theophorus. Those are the names because you named one of your characters Laganaloo after Anu, because there are a lot of names that characters are named after gods in some sense, like Elijah is, like Israel is, all of that. And I've now forgotten the word since I said it 2 seconds ago. Theophorus names, that's what they're called. I remembered that word, so I'm happy about that. But I asked you to come back on the show because it's Christmas, so Merry Christmas. And
Merry Christmas.
Christmas, a lot of people think it's pagan or some other just consumerist holiday, but this time of the year is about the most epic instance of spiritual warfare that has ever existed on the face of the planet. And I thought, who better to talk about this moment in history than the guy who's written books about it and written about that spiritual warfare. So I know you have some ideas of where to go, and I think you're right. I think we do need to maybe prime some people so they understand what we're talking about a little bit better. But that's what you're here for, because I respect the hell out of you, and I want to hear more of your thoughts.
Sure. Well, we talked a little bit about before the show about this, so who knows where we're going to end up, because there's lots of different rabbit trails that we can go down for sure. But I think that in terms of context of Christmas and what you bring up and how that subverts the Watcher paradigm, at least to some degree, we all of us here have a basic understanding of the divine counsel. And I think that it certainly begins there, because the classic passage, Genesis 6, 1-4, the sons of God, who are divine beings from heaven, see that the daughters of men are beautiful, and they take them as wives, and they bore them children, and they're called them the Nephilim, or the giants, actually. And they are great men or warriors of renown. And there's different ways of interpreting that passage, and I don't think that just coming at it from a strictly hyper literalist, like it's just without appreciating. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying, however one interprets that, and I think there's a basic truth to it, that it's speaking somewhat factually, but it's given to us in the context, in a very specific theological context in that ancient world. And so I think it's important to know that context, because it helps sort of fill out the meaning of it. And what I mean by that is that Genesis 6, 1-4 there's the storyline, that theological thread is in other religions as well. And the concept of these divine beings coming and mating with human women, many people will say, oh, that smacks of, that's obvious mythology because the Greeks have that with the gods. And, and of course they do. And in fact, all ancient religions have some form of gods mating with humans, etc. And, that's to sort of see parallels as a proof of sort of, I don't know, common borrowing or sort of common fantasies, common mythologies, etc. is it's not just naive, it's actually ignorant and uneducated, because while there are connections between cultures and there is borrowing of images and concepts, I think the polemical aspect is what's mostly missed.
Yeah.
And I think the polemical aspect that's going on here is that, and of course there's an ancient Mesopotamian background to this as well, where the Mesopotamian mythology believed that they had these beings called the Apkallu, and the Apkallu were the divine wise ones. They often had like fish suits, men with fish suits on them. If you see the Assyrian engravings and such. And, they believe that the Apkallu were the wise ones who came down from heaven and gave wisdom to mankind, And so this was a common motif, actually, that mankind got its wisdom from the heavenly beings. And then, of course, some of these heavenly beings mated, and you would get mated with humans, and that's how you would get certain kingships like Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was considered, oddly enough, 2/3. I think it's 2/3 human, one third God. I don't know how they get that out, right? But nonetheless, that was a common motif as well. That the gods, or that and Egypt, of course, as well, had the concept that Pharaoh was the son of. Pharaoh was Horus on earth, the son of,
Ra.
son of Ra, in heaven. And so this concept is very common, but the way the Hebrews use it, there's a polemical element to it. And it's sort of like, you say that these wise ones came and gave wisdom to mankind, but we say that they were angelic beings who were wicked, and they actually brought evil to mankind. And of course, then you have extra canonical sources like the book of First Enoch that many of us do, believe is, well, it certainly was a source of some of the New Testament writings. So, I don't think it's scripture personally, but, it certainly is a worthy source. Let's put it that way. And of course, there we we see how the Jewish understanding was certainly that the Apkallu that came from heaven were actually demonic beings, and they were giving negative. Yeah, they did give some positive source to mankind, but it was largely negative. They taught mankind war and fornication and all this kind of stuff, and a lot of occultic stuff, right? Why? Because the Hebrew concept was very much polemical against the ancient concepts. So same thing with the Garden of Eden, right? I mean, the serpent in many of the ancient religions was more a positive character, the eternal life of shedding the skin. And they believed again that serpent brings wisdom, and the wisdom in Genesis, of course, that the serpent brings is a deception. It's really you're going to be like God, you're going to know good and evil, but so doing it, claiming that prerogative of God, cuts you off from God and actually brings death. And so the serpent is actually a symbol of evil in a way. In the ancient world, he was not. And in other words, they're saying this wisdom that you think you're getting from the gods is actually deception and brings death. So there's this polemic that's going on, regardless of whether or not you believe it really happened the way it said or not. So this applies to any interpretation of that text. And so, and of course, I as an evangelical Christian, I believe I believe that the text accurately depicts our prehistory, Genesis and such, but it does so in a very literary way, which means it's not always hyper literal like most people assume. Well,
Right.
that's exactly what it says is exactly the way it happened. No, there are ways of writing and telling stories in the ancient world to communicate concepts that don't need to be the literal scientific rendering that we, with our modern bias, misunderstand. Okay, but I take it at face value and I seek for the meaning. Right. So, all this to say that this concept of the violation of the earthly heavenly divide, this violation of gods and men, right? Universal concept in the Bible, it's clearly negative because you see that these sons of God mating with humanity violates that separation.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is this is a whole nother study. Looking through the creation account, one of the emphasis is separation. Separates light from darkness, separates land from the sea, separates the sky, right? Sky from the earth. So, and that's rooted in the holiness code, meaning creation is a kind of separation of things. It's building the binaries, which are now, of course, in the postmodern woke world, is literally attacking that directly. There are no binaries. It's the rejection of the binaries. But of course, part of the binary is also good and evil. And if there are no binaries, then there's no binary of good and evil either. And so all these things are linked, obviously. And so what we see happening is that they're saying that this violation is negative, whereas in many religions, it's not good or evil. It just simply is. And of course, there are these demigods created by this, and the Hebrews are saying, that's a wrong thing. That's a bad thing. And in particular, this mating brings about progeny. The result of that. And what are the progeny? In Genesis 6, it says it's the Nephilim. And the word for Nephilim is a transliteration of the original language. The translators did not translate the word. And I think honestly, it's because of their bias. They were afraid that if they translated what it should be translated as, which is giants, that it would sound mythological to people. So they didn't. They just call it Nephilim, which is what the word is in Hebrew, right? And Aramaic as well. But anyway, nevertheless, that's a whole nother pathway of
Can I just say
discussion.
What's funny about that is in the King James version, you see them mention unicorns like 8 or 9 times, which is a hilarious thing that people try to use to like argue against the Bible. This is obviously mythological and fantastical. It's like, and so like them not translating the word Nephilim because they're worried about fantasy is hilarious because they used what is essentially a scientific word for rhinoceros at that point in history, and now they're claiming that the Bible is fantastical because they use the word unicorn.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And of course, there is a fantastical element of divine beings, mating with humans and creating hybrid creatures. I grant that. In fact, it sounds fantastical to me, and it requires a faith commitment that we don't always know. We never know for sure about some things, and so I believe the text. So, but anyway, but what does that look like? That's a different picture. That's a different sort of reality than what we may literally see it as. But taking it face value, reading theologically, reading the meaning of the text and what that means, and of course my novel series Chronicles of the Nephilim, I do that, and I add a fantastical component to sort of stress the spiritual reality that I'm trying to communicate there. But so you have these hybrid creatures, and in the Hebrew mind, that like I said, Gilgamesh and Mesopotamia and such, they're usually demigods who have power and such. But in the Hebrew mind, they're actually cursed creatures, because you're not supposed to violate the holiness that God does in his creation, the separation that he engages in. And the heavenly and the earthly flesh, in particular, angelic flesh versus human flesh. Angels are not just spirits flitting around. They are actual interdimensional beings that have flesh. They can eat, they can fornicate, right? And the Bible shows this stuff. And they're not the same as human flesh. Jude talks about how there's a difference between heavenly flesh and human flesh.
I mean, so the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the strange flesh, like it's there.
That's in Jude where it just talks about the strange flesh. And so, meaning it's different flesh, different kinds of flesh. And even in Corinthians talks about, Paul talks about the different heavenly bodies and earthly bodies have different glories, so to speak, which is sort of different essential realities. Okay. And so what we're getting at here is that it's an evil concept. And so you have these beings, and their curse is then linked to the promised land. And the promised land, okay, so the Nephilim, the flood comes. After the Nephilim comes, God says, violence is upon all the land, not just humans, but the land is filled with violence. So I think that part of that violation brought on the violence. And the book of Enoch talks about the giants and how violent they were and such. But so those giants are not, they're bad people. But then God judges the earth, right? He kills all beings in the story. And so that's part of the judgment on that violation. So you don't really see any more of that after the flood, any more of that sons of God coming and mating, right? Now, there's the hint of it, I think, in Sodom and Gomorrah, and my novels, the way I retell that story, I sort of take the tack that after the huge flood, the angels got it, like, okay, we're not going to do this again, but then they started pushing the envelope, and then they got burned like by fire, which is the opposite. Anyway, so these beings are bad, and where was I going with this? So they're destroyed in the flood. And the next time you hear the word Nephilim, that word in the biblical text, is in Numbers. There's only two places, Genesis and Numbers. And it's when the spies go, they spy out the land, they say, hey, the land is the land of giants. The Nephilim are there. Or they say the Anakim are there, and the Anakim are giants. And I think this is Numbers 32, I think. I should have my Bible open there. Numbers 32. No, it's not.
I know there's something about Jonathan killing the brother of Goliath, I think in like Numbers 20 or 21. I only know that because I searched for it today because I was reading this book by this guy, and I was like, where is that? I know that somewhere.
Yeah. This is really bad because I should have this. Numbers
13?
13. I'm that 1330, something like that, right? Numbers 1332.
1332 through 33.
That's why I had backwards. Sorry. So Numbers 1332 around and there's some. And then he says, we saw the Nephilim. They're the sons of Anak. And if you just study the word of Anak in the Bible, you'll see the Anakim are their descendants, and multiple passages say they were giants. They were tall, like the cedars. They were, a great people, but tall and such. And these Anakim who are in the land of Israel, I'm sorry, not Israel, Canaan. It says who come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in their sight. So and it says that the land devours its inhabitants. So there's this sort of, notion of, it's not cannibalism per se, but certainly it's a very violent, destructive culture in Canaan led by these giants, these Anakim. And that's the only other place. And so whatever you believe about the flood, the writer of Numbers is saying these giants in the land are connected to the Nephilim, who we all consider bad guys before the flood, right?
Yeah.
And so when God says to harem, these harem was, the ban, meaning you are to go and kill the men, women, and children and animals of certain tribes. Well, those particular tribes were these giant tribes, because at the end of Joshua, after Joshua was wiped, people say, oh, God was committing genocide in the Bible. He's genocidal maniac. Well, it wasn't actually genocide. He wasn't killing everybody. They were actually killing specific tribes, and these tribes were connected to these giants, see? And in Joshua 11:21, after it's all been done, it says, Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country. That the hill country is where they wanted to settle, and of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel, Joshua devoted them to destruction. That's the ban, with their cities. So the Anakim were the specific targets of God, not everybody. And why? Why? Well, there was none Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel, only in Gaza and in Gath, the Philistine cities. And so he didn't do it. He didn't pull off the job fully. But the idea here is that the text is showing us is that these are cursed beings, because they're the hybrid creatures, and God wants to clean the land of that corruption to prepare for his people, because his people are going to be in the land of Canaan, right? And so these Nephilim, then they're dead, and most of them were dead at the flood. And how did the Nephilim come back if God killed everyone with the worldwide flood? Well, the flood might not be worldwide, or even if it was, maybe there could have been one of the wives of the sons had some genetic connection to them, or what have you. Or there might have been some new interbreeding between angels and humans that the Bible doesn't mention, But nonetheless, they come from those original Nephilim. So I think that there's a genetic connection there. Anyway.
One of the things you brought up, the polemical connection, and I just got done going back through another study of Kings. And one of the things that was so wonderful is that it really does tie that together when you realize one of the kings of Syria that they have a problem with is Ben-Hadad. Well, what does Ben-Hadad's name mean? It means Ben, son of Hadad, one of the Syrian gods.
Baal.
So what we start seeing this connection through all of the enemies of Israel. And it's something that we see carry very much into the New Testament as well. So it just goes right back to God saying, hey, so all these people like Ben-Hadad, he claims to be from Ben-Hadad. And in the mystical worldview, it may well be. And that's the thing, is that God is saying that is no good. And that's,
Yeah. Now there was another ancient thing was that the kings claim to be sons of the gods and such. So there was that theology, but I think that that's rooted in what may have actually really taken place. So,
yes.
So these kings are claiming to be those divine hybrids, but I think that's I think that's probably more of a justification, a rationalization of their power, right? Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, it's rooted in the same concept, absolutely. And so that's the context that we have, so that when Christ comes and Christ is born, what is the message? The message is the Son of God. Sons of God came and made with, well, he's the Son of God by virgin birth, which means the deity himself impregnated the human woman, which is exactly the claim that they're making with these angels. But of course, God, it doesn't say God had sex with her, because of course God is a spirit being. And so, he as creator, he could just impregnate her by saying, be impregnated with his own words, right? So there is a kind of maybe a mockery in some way, but I think it's sort of a reverse mockery. What I mean by that is, I think that these divine beings back in the ancient past sought to do the thing that they knew God would ultimately do, but they sought to do it on their own and such. Whereas God actually brings about his unique generated son, which we'll talk about that, his unique son of God through a human woman. And in a way that, that is the center point of history, the center point of theology is Christ for us as Christians. And that he is a hybrid. He is literally a hybrid of 100% man, 100% God. Now, the difference is that the Nephilim were, half human, half angelic. But according to Christian theology, understanding the New Testament correctly, I think the incarnation of Jesus is he's 100% human and 100% God, because he was born of woman, but his seed was from the Father. And so what you have here is in the incarnation of Christ, he is a son of God. Now, theologically speaking, we believe Christ was pre-existent as the Son of God forever. And that's one thing pathway I do want to go down is, isn't that the same word, Jesus, Son of God? And what about these sons of God, right? Where's the connection there? We'll talk about that, the sons of God and the divine council, and then how Jesus is part of that. But nevertheless, John 3:16, God so loved the world, he gives only begotten son. The Greek there is or the English translation is not very good. The more recent scholarship has come to acknowledge that what it's saying there is not that he's the only son of God. It's saying he's the unique son of God, meaning he's unlike others, right? And so,
just as an interjection, because
Sure.
Isaac is also given that term, and Isaac is not the only begotten son of Abraham.
Yes,
and what's
Hebrews.
interesting, yeah.
Yes,
So
Hebrews
what's
says that.
interesting is that it's as if the Nephilim made the same mistake that Abraham made. The angels tried to do Abraham. Abraham made the same mistake that they made
Yeah.
when he fathered Ishmael of his own flesh.
Yeah, certainly that represents the same concept of him trying to accomplish God's purposes through his own means. Absolutely, sure. So there's that conceptual connection, but now we have to say, well, let's go back to the beginning, because or maybe before we do, there might be something more that one of you guys might want to talk about that. But that's where this thing comes in with how the incarnation uniquely begins to address the Watcher paradigm or the divine council, which is a whole nother thread that we'll get to address. But that's sort of the setup for the incarnation and who Jesus is.
What I think is really fascinating, and reading your books has kind of helped me think about this a little bit more, is you see throughout history, you see it in Egypt, and then you see God's complete decimation of the gods of Egypt, the judgment of the gods of Egypt, but you see that there, you see it throughout history. It becomes the divine right of kings. You have all these different people who claimed essentially to be a demigod in order to be a king or a mighty man or whatever. And so there's this paradigm that's laid down by God's enemies that God then goes, "Oh, I'm going to subvert that. I've got that, and you're right. But you can't do it. I can." And I love that.
Yeah.
I love that subversion.
Yeah, absolutely. But in a very real sense, in a sense, I almost think like theirs is the pre-perversion. Like they know what God's going to do to a certain degree. They don't know everything, right? But and they try to get the jump on God and do it their way, kind of like that Isaac and Ishmael thing, where Ishmael is the son of Abraham by virtue of Abraham trying to accomplish what God wants to do his way. You know what I mean? Like, even though he knows to a certain degree God's going to give him, God promises what he's going to do, but Abraham doesn't fully understand, so he thinks he has to do it his way. Well, that's where I think that in a way, outside of time and space, outside of our reality, it's reversed. Really, the perversion or the mockery is in the angels seeking to do beforehand in order to mess up God's plans, what they knew God was going to do. That's kind of how I see it. So in a way, God's not really using something that they came up with, but rather they knew it was going to happen and they twisted it to try to pervert it beforehand. And there's a whole nother component there too with what I call the War of the Seed in my Chronicles of the Nephilim, where I do think too that because of the proto-evangelion in Genesis 3:15, that the seed of the serpent will be at war with the seed of the woman, and he will bring an individual person who will strike the head of the serpent, and the serpent will strike his heel. And so that's the first messianic promise. So in a sense, they knew something of what was going to take place. And so they sought to destroy that seed by corrupting it. And I think that's part of the corruption that's going on with the Nephilim. He's like, okay, if you're going to do this, then we're going to try to corrupt human seed so that Messiah can't be born to be the pure deity that you want him to be. And we're gonna be our own deities and create our own hybrids and this kind of stuff. Yeah, real messy sort of thing going on there. But so what does this mean? Jesus is the Son of God, and it sounds similar to this phrase I mentioned in Genesis 6, sons of God. Is there a connection going on there? Well, first of all, and maybe you've talked about this before. I think, or we certainly have. But the concept of the divine council, the sons of God, let's just address that off the top here, that sons of God in the Bible is a very specific technical term. There are times where God uses the word children of God or you're my son as a metaphor. Sure, and that's used a lot. But an actual phrase, B'nai Ha-Elohim or B'nai Elohim or B'nai Elohim, or sons of the Most High is another different way of saying the same thing, but it's this technical term that it's connected to. It's not just saying, "Oh, you're my son." Like there's a famous passage where Israel is in Hosea 11. God says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." A lot of people say, "Oh, see, Israel was the son of God." No, actually, that's not. He's using sonship as a metaphor, surely, but he doesn't say son of God. Very specifically, I think, because you do a study on it, you see that the concepts or the technical term sons of God, or son of God is a very different thing than the metaphor son. So another case is Adam. And the only other person that's called a son of God is Adam. In Luke 3:38, Adam is called the Son of God. And so what does that mean? Is that the same thing as Jesus? How is that different? I think what that means is the concept Son of God means, if you do the study on it, it basically means a direct creation or begetting of God. In other words, all of us are, or all of biological beings, but all of humanity is begotten through, the humans, the sexual intercourse of two, human beings, right? Seed and egg, etc. But the concept of Son of God is something that is a direct connection to God directly. Adam was created directly from God. He wasn't birthed through a mother. So this notion of being birthed through a human mother and having a human father seed, right? That is normal birth, but Son of God is a unique direct creation or begetting of God. So when you read these sons of God in heaven, who are they? You look in other passages throughout the Bible, you see such as, what you're going to see is these sons of God are divine beings. We sometimes use the word angels now, but I think angels is a very weak term because it's a generic term that means many different things. And I don't think it's the best thing to call them. Sons of God are God's divine heavenly host who surround him on his throne / court, and they give him divine counsel. They give him advice or suggestions on what to do. This is how the text presents it. Or they worship him and glorify him, right? And they do things that he tells them to do. So some of these passages where we get this from is Job 1 and 2. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan also came amongst them, and that's where Satan goes, hey, have you considered Job? Yeah, he'll curse you and all this kind of stuff. Well, the presentation there is these heavenly beings, these sons of God, are somehow around God's divine counsel. Another famous passage is, for those who know, is Malachi, 1 Kings 22. And that's where Micaiah talking to King Ahab, and he talks about the scene he sees in heaven. And the scene is the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing beside him. Now, what is host of heaven? Well, host is basically many beings, So they were sitting on his right hand and his left, and God says, who will entice Ahab and send a deceiving spirit? And a spirit says, I'll entice him. And God says, okay, go do that. And God puts a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets. So this concept is they're around his throne, they're giving advice, etc., etc. And then sons of God, I mentioned earlier that sons of the Most High is another phrase. And the reason why I use that is because Psalm 82 is a very powerful passage where it describes this divine counsel that we're already talking about. Psalm 82, the whole chapter, just read it. It's real powerful. God has taken his place in the divine council. Okay, so that's up in heaven. Translation is assembly of El. El is a word for the creator God. In the midst of the gods, Yahweh holds judgment. So these divine beings are called sons of God. Further down the passage, it says, I said, you are God's sons of the Most High, all of you. So he's talking these beings around his throne. And he says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. So he's telling them, you are supposed to rule with justice somehow. These heavenly beings rule with justice. And then he says, I said, you are God's sons of the Most High. So what the text is showing us is that these sons of God are also called sons of the Most High around his counsel. They give him wisdom, but also it says that God gave them, or they're supposed to judge justly over humanity. What does that mean? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but I just want to make the point here that they are called gods.
Yeah.
The word Elohim. And now many evangelical Christians would have a hard time accepting that because, give me a second here.
Because of Islam?
I had to turn that heater off.
I just, when you said I just quit because of Islam.
What?
Just the influence of Islam in its strict monotheism.
Yeah.
It changed the face.
Sure, but not just Islam. I mean, even just Christianity itself has become a sort of, how can I say, a distorted understanding of what monotheism in the Bible really is like.
Right.
Meaning there's only one God and then there's no other gods at all. Mm. And the Bible doesn't talk that way. And so we have to use the biblical language. There are other gods. What does that mean? Is that polytheism? No. What it means is the word gods is Elohim. And we have to understand that, do a study on Elohim and you see, hold on. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So the word Elohim is actually an
ontological term, right?
It's an ontological term of beings who dwell in that spiritual realm. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's used of a dead person of, like, for instance, Samuel's brought up from Hades and he's called an Elohim, right? And sometimes these angelic beings or divine beings, heavenly hosts, are called Elohim. And God is called Elohim. God is called the Elohim of Elohim, the God of gods, right? Which means God is God. All of these are spiritual beings, but God is the supreme being, and there's no one like him, and he's the only creator. And so the way the Bible talks is not quite the way modern evangelical understands, but it doesn't mean it's polytheism. That's the bottom line, right? So we've got these connections going on. And but what is this justice and judging? How are these beings judging over humanity? Well, you go back into Deuteronomy 32 and you read that and you get this, amazing passage about Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10. when the Most High, there it is again, that word Most High, gave to the nations their inheritance. He's talking about Gentiles there. When he divided mankind, he's talking about Babel. So when God divided mankind at Babel, he gave their inheritance. What does that mean? The Gentile nations are described in Genesis 10. The concept there is that, I'll finish the text. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion, his heritage is Jacob, right? So what's going on here? I'm going to delete the rest of that. Delete the rest of that. So what's going on here is that there's a allotment, meaning God is saying, after the Tower of Babel, you're so wicked, I'm going to give you over to these false gods that you worship, right? Because he destroyed the earth and then they started worshiping false gods. They built towers to the heaven, the ziggurat, which was a tower of the gods, and they thought they would connect with the gods that way. So they continued to worship idols. So God said, okay, I'm going to give you over to them. And he's going to say, I'm going to have my allotted people are Israel or Jacob, and their land's going to be, the territory I'm going to give them is going to be what I give them. But I'm going to give these other nations, they're going to have their own borders and territories, right? Nations. And the Gentile nations are going to be under the allotment of the sons of God. What does that mean? Well, at that point in time, their understanding the sons of God were, these are fallen beings, not all of them, but they've fallen from heaven, just like the ones in Genesis 6. They come down from earth. They violate God's heavenly divide of earth and heaven. Jude says that those defiant angels were imprisoned in the earth, right? Whatever that means, they're imprisoned. Okay, so because of their violation, God imprisoned those angels. So evidently, it didn't stop. And it didn't stop them. And so these sons of God, there's still some rebellious sons of God around. And God says, okay, mankind, you're going to be under their authority. You Gentile nations are going to be under their dominance. They're going to be ruling over you. So now we have this concept that is in all ancient religions, and certainly in the Near East, ancient Near East, and certainly in the Bible, that there is a link between heaven and earth. The earthly authorities, kings, nations, cities, they have authorities over them, spiritual authorities, and they are these sons of God, right? And so, but they're Gentile nations and they're rebellious. So somehow, in some way, these sons of God who are supposed to be over these Gentile nations did not carry out their responsibilities before God, according to Psalm 82 that we just read, right? Does that mean were they good and then they fell, or were they always evil? That's a whole nother debate. The point is, what the text is saying, they weren't just rulers over those earthly rulers. And so what you have in history is these Gentile nations who hate God, and they have their fallen watchers. Daniel 4 calls them watchers, right? There are watchers over the nations. The prince of Persia in Daniel, what is that? That's not 4. I always forget this one. I think it's Daniel 11. The prince of Persia and the prince of Greece are defined as spiritual princes over nations. Mm-hmm. And those nations are at battle with Michael, the prince of Israel. This is all in Daniel, right? So these princes over the nations are the watchers over the nations. And this is where all this stuff is bubbling up. And this is why sons of God are very specific divine beings given these kinds of authority. And God says, I will be the watcher over Israel, essentially, right? And so when Jesus comes, let's see if have I addressed everything about that needs to be addressed.
I just want to say one thing that's just funny is there is a popular creator on TikTok who I won't name, who some of his stuff is really good, but he took on the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and he said, he was like, he was arguing with someone. He said, I'll grant it to you that in the Bible, every time they use the word sons of God, it's not just, that always refers to spiritual beings. He goes, except this one time. And it's like, how? How do you figure? Is just
What
because
one
you're
time?
uncomfortable? The allotment.
Oh, the
They'll
allotment.
say it's the line
Interesting.
of Seth. And they're
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
he's like, this is the one time it doesn't mean that. And I'm
yeah.
like,
Yeah. The NASB translation tries that trickery. If you want to beat your head against the wall, read NASB Psalm 82, because it literally tries to say he stands in the assembly of the judges. It's like at no time does Elohim ever apply to a human being. I'm sorry.
Yes, yes.
Just
Now they
does not.
claim it does. People, there are some who will claim it does, and they'll use references to Exodus. But Michael Heiser has decimated these arguments pretty well on his website. I think it's called moreunseenrealm.com or something like that, or Under the Unseen Realm, you'll get more of. And he talks about how these passages that in Exodus and such that refer to Elohim, and they think that they're referring to judges, are actually referring to God. Like when you come before the judges, and it calls them gods, right? It's like, no, actually it's saying you're coming before God. God is there. The judge represents him, sure, but God is actually there. You're coming before God. He is there. And so it's the word for Elohim is not reference to the human beings, it's a reference to Elohim himself, God being there. So yeah, there are answers to all these doubts, but there are, arguments and such. But here's the interesting thing, because when we get to Jesus, he kind of clarifies, are these sons of God human judges, or are they divine beings? Now, my argument is they're divine beings who are also judges, not judges, they are rulers over these Gentile nations, so they have authority over them, right? And this is all going to be important for the gospel eventually, but John 10, where Jesus being accused of blasphemy, and they try to stone him, and Jesus says, why are you trying to stone me? It's not for the good works you do, they said, but for blasphemy, because you being a man make yourself out to be God. John 10, right? Jesus answered them, is it not written in your own law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came and scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, Jesus, you are blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? I am the Son of God. So people say, well, yeah, see, so Jesus is saying that judges are called gods. No, actually, he's not. Because if you think that's, and Jesus is quoting Psalm 82, I said you are gods, nevertheless you shall die like sons of God, sons of the Most High, right? I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, or sons of God. And people say, well, so Jesus is just saying, yeah, that humans are called gods. These are humans who are judges, who are responsible for the people, are representative of God, therefore they're called gods. That's not true. Because if you believe that's true, then what you're saying is Jesus is not claiming to be God in this passage. He's just claiming to be a human judge. Yeah. But the whole context is he's claiming to be God, and they're accusing him of it. And he's going, well, doesn't your own text say this? So clearly Jesus is using Psalm 82 as deity to prove his deity. So the sons of God are considered divine beings according to Jesus. Jesus himself gives us the exegesis of that concept, sons of God. And there's a lot more to this, but and there's a lot more scriptures that talk about this, but that's the main concept. So what's the point then? You've got these sons of God who are, they're rulers over nations and such. And what's the point of that? Well, God is saying, look, back in Deuteronomy 32, he's like, if you're going to, this is Romans 1. See, Romans 1 says, man, God gave the truth, and man suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, and he worshiped the creation instead of the creator. And they did all these evil things and wickedness and such. And then it says, God gave them over. And so that's what I think is happening in Babel, in Deuteronomy 32 and Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. What's happening is God's saying, okay, you're going to keep worshiping these idols. I'm going to give you over to them. They're going to be your gods. You're going to be under their authority. And I'm going to have one people for me in one land. And everyone else are going to be Gentiles, and they're all lost. And you're all going to be in bondage to them. because they're your authorities. This is why we have throughout the Bible the concept that when there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven. Why? Daniel 11, because someone researched that. I want to get that down. I'm not sure if it's Daniel 11. It might be Daniel 7. I should have that down. Daniel 4 is the Watchers, but the Prince of Persia is Daniel 10, I think. I'm sorry. I think it's Daniel 10. And so
Yeah, Daniel 10.
Daniel 10. Okay, so the Prince of Persia, so there are, and the concept there is that when Persia, it's very clear that Daniel is about Israel is in bondage to Persia at this time, Persia. And so it's described as the Prince of Persia is ruler over them. But the Prince of Greece is battling with Prince of Persia. Why? Because the next nation in Daniel's nations of Gentiles who are beasts who are controlling Israel is Greece. So the Prince of Greece is battling with the Prince of Persia because historically Greece battled with Persia and took it over from them. And then they took over control of Israel after that. So the concept in Daniel 10 there is very clearly that these princes, Watchers in Daniel 4 is another term for them maybe. But the idea is that they're these princes over the nations, and when nations war, the princes in heaven are warring. There's many, many passages on that. If you want to get more, get my book Psalm 82, where I go through all these details, as well as my book when giants were upon the earth. That's even more detailed, but both of them together would be very helpful.
Let me just throw this out here real quick.
Oh, sure.
Because you're talking about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. I know the answer to this, but who is the prince over Israel?
That's
Israel's
Michael.
Prince?
That's Michael. And there are theologians who, and most of them agree that those princes are clearly spiritual princes. Now there's argument. Some Christians believe that Michael is another word for Jesus because of certain other New Testament passages. I don't think that's true though, because I think they're separate. But so Michael is the Prince of Israel. Now he's in the stead. Now Yahweh says, "I will be there." So how can that be? Well, God appoints Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, biblical Judaism. Not rabbinic. Biblical Judaism is very specifically representative, which means rulers represent their people. Federal representation is the concept of the Bible, which means people are represented by their rulers, and that's why you must submit to them. But also, that's why if rulers are bad, people get punished because they represent the people. If the people are bad, the rulers get punished because they're represented by their rulers. So there's a deep, deep connection between rulers and those who they rule over. That's why there's also heavenly rulers who are connected to the earthly rulers. And so all the stuff that's going on is there's a good, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I think it's, and we'll definitely get into this later, but I did want to, preload this in. But, in the first letter of the Corinthians, Paul talks about food sacrificed to idols. And he talks, and there's also the verse about, this is, you're not waging war against people. It's against principalities and powers in the dark places. But, in 1 Corinthians 10:19 through 21, I love Paul. What am I trying to say? Am I saying that food sacrificed to idols has some significance or that idols are real gods? No, not at all. I'm saying these sacrifices are offered to demons, not to God. And I don't want you to participate with demons. I just want to throw that out there because these principalities, these princes, Paul talks about them.
Yes.
One thing I want to throw in just real quick, because I love this, that we're having this conversation right now, having just finished Kings. Because what do we see in Kings? We see Jeroboam building the high places to other gods.
Yeah.
Offering an alternative to biblical Judaism, like you just said.
Didn't he put Asherim in the temple?
He built an idol in the temple, but it was not a necessary. The text doesn't say it was an Asherim idol, but there was so much.
I don't know if it was him, but there was an Asherah in the temple for almost the entire time of the temple.
Yeah. So we could see that from either Jeroboam. Well, no, Jeroboam did not run Jerusalem.
No, he did. He did
Samaria.
Jeroboam did the. Didn't he do the golden calves?
Yes, he built golden calves.
Rehoboam.
It was later kings that built the ashram, and then they stayed in the temple for almost the whole 400 years or whatever.
So yeah, I mean, they don't even mention the law for the entire time. The law is never brought. The word of God never brought up in Kings, from David all the way to Josiah. When it comes
Wow.
out again, it's like, oh wow! So for 400 years, no one picked up the Bible and read it. And that's the thing, is that they just, the Levites, they memorized all of this. And what's so neat about what you're saying is you see that in Jeroboam. You see that spiritual rebellion. He's rebelling against the order of Yahweh. The order that Yahweh has set
Distinction.
is these specific sacrifices in this specific place in Jerusalem, in the temple. And Jeroboam just threw it all out. He made idolatry. He made alternative everything. So
yeah. And I think what Paul writes is rooted in an Old Testament concept. Now, there's not a lot of passages, but there's enough to just point out that this is probably real. Deuteronomy 32:17, the same passage, but further down, he's talking about how Israel went and sacrificed to false gods. And he says they sacrificed to demons that were not God, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently. And so what he's saying is Asherah and Baal that the Israelites sacrificed to were demons, right? So certainly I think the context is demonic. Whether or not they're demons in the sense that we think of demons might be different, but nonetheless, they're demonic, real beings of some kind. Does that mean there's a one-to-one correspondence? There's a Baal demon, there's a Asherah demon. I don't know. I don't think the text says anything about those details. I don't think that it is a one-to-one correspondence. Some people do, because the problem is that there's so many gods. Like,
Right.
there are thousands in Egypt alone. There's hundreds in Canaan. So you're going to have this
Billions
problem. Okay.
in India.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, if you want to sit and say, well, they're all actual real demons. No, I think God's making the point that there is demonic reality behind this worship. And how that manifests itself, who knows? The way I do it in my novels is I say, look, there's a limited amount of watchers, right? And there's watchers and maybe some of their companions distinctly over nations and such. And they maybe they even took on several disguises, so to speak, right? Pretended to be Baal or something. And certainly they just take on, because these gods are not real beings. And so if the gods of the ancient world had a demonic reality behind them, this is speculation on my part, but it would make sense that they might be these fallen watchers, since the fallen watchers are the bad guys who are given authority over the nation. So it would make sense that as spiritual beings, they would pretend to be all these gods to draw worship away from Yahweh. And that's one of the speculative theological principles of all my series, Chronicles of the Nephilim and Watchers and Apocalypse. And so, but I think it's still rooted in actual biblical texts, at least theologically. And that's why I wrote all these novels, because I found that so fascinating. So what's going on here? What's the point? What are we saying? Is it just this, battle of chaotic, God is like the force, the good, the bad, dark side, and all this kind of stuff? No. And what's going on is that God creates humanity falls. He gives them, now I believe God sovereignly determines all things, but nevertheless, man is responsible and man has a freedom. It's not completely autonomous in the sense that he has power that's apart from God, but man is still given a freedom, and his freedom and responsibility, moral freedom, to certainly, and when man falls, and that fallenness affects us all, we all come from him, then that fallenness is universal, right? And so, where was I going with this? The fallenness of humanity.
So now the redemption in the incarnation.
Yeah. So that fallenness never leaves him. God can redeem people, but what he says is, he destroys the world because it gets so bad, starts over again, and mankind's sinful nature is still there, and it proves that it's not going to go away. They build the tower, they worship false gods again. So God gives them over. He says, okay, Here's what I'm going to do. Does this mean God made it up on the fly? No, I don't believe that. I think he's got everything planned out. But nonetheless, in terms of history, this is how it happened. And so God says, here's what I'm going to do is mankind is so fallen and they cannot save themselves, and they cannot but worship false gods and defy me. Therefore, I'm going to give them over. They're going to be under the authority of these fallen spiritual beings, and they're going to be in bondage to them. And we look at history and we see the ancient world was very much in bondage to, these gods and such. And he says, I'm going to create my own people. He takes a pagan named Abraham. Says, I'm going to create my people. God does his will regardless of what other people think or want. God chooses Abraham and says, I'm going to create a people out of you, and they're going to be my people. Like these other watchers are over these nations. I'm going to have my own people. And then he says, and one day you're going to bless all the nations on the earth. Well, if all the nations are Gentile nations under bondage to some other gods, how is that going to happen, right? How is it possible? God promised you're going to bless all the nations on the earth when they're all fallen, they're all rebellious, right? So you can see that this is the inheritance that the Bible talks about. There's a lot about inheritance and allotment. In the ancient world, they had, and we still do today, right? But certainly it was, a lot of their identity was rooted in the territories that they owned. And God says, I'm going to give Canaan, it's going to be called Israel. I'm going to give that to my people. I'm going to portion it out, allot it out. The other nations are allotted their territories and their gods. But I'm going to allot this in, and I'm going to have a territory on earth for my people. And so it's this allotted inheritance. And so, but then what he says is, and this is where we get to Psalm 83 or 82. And we mentioned this already. God's in this divine council. He's got all these heavenly hosts, and that's a whole nother thing. The word heavenly host is a concept in the Bible that means both the sun and the stars and the moons and God's divine beings who surround his throne. Well, how can that be? They're used for both at the same time. Well, in the ancient world, they likened those two together. Even in the Bible, stars are likened to gods or Elohim, or what we would call angels maybe, or sons of God. So does that mean they believe that the stars literally were? It doesn't matter. They're likened and they're used interchangeably. Because the stars and their shiningness were sort of certainly, I think, representative of their belief of the shining glory of these heavenly beings. And so when you see the word heavenly host, you got to understand by the context what he's talking about. But, of course, the ancient world worshiped the stars and the sun and the moon. And so those were gods in a way too. So God's saying, no, the heavenly hosts are my divine beings. They're around my throne. So God has taken his place in the divine council, Psalm 82. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. He's judging, and he's judging them. Because remember how he said, I gave you these people to rule over, but you didn't rule. The Gentile nations are fallen. Their rulers over them are fallen. There's another passage that Psalm 89, same context, this sort of helps fill it out a little bit. He says, no, that's not the psalm I want to talk about. There's another passage that reinforces what I'm talking about here, and it's this. It is, here we go. No, wrong passage, sorry. Here we go. Okay. Here we go. Psalm 58. There's several others, but this is just a little bit more direct. Psalm 58, 1 and 2. Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? This is God talking to the gods. Do you judge the children of man uprightly? No. In your hearts you devise wrongs. Your hands deal out violence on the earth. So again, there are many more passages that reinforce this notion, the assembly of the holy ones. It's a whole other thing to talk about. Holy ones is a term that's used of these divine beings. So So getting back to the storyline, so God has these beings in Psalm 82. He's judging them, and we don't know when this is going to happen yet, but this certainly is something that's going to happen. And he says, "You've shown partiality. You don't give justice to the weak. You don't rescue the needy." And he says, "All the foundations of the earth are shaken." And if you do study in the Bible, and I do in my book, End Times Bible Prophecy, I talk about the foundations of the earth being shaken is a common covenantal term. It's a term of covenant. And it also represents these fall of powers. If the fall of a nation, Babylon, was described as the foundations of the earth being shaken, the fall of angelic powers is described as the earth being shaken. So he's saying these heavenly powers, authorities over man, have been wicked, and the covenant is broken. I said, "You are gods. Nevertheless, you shall die like men." So he's going to judge them. He's going to judge them by killing these divine beings with death, which is something usually just reserved for humans, right? That's what he's saying. And then he says, well, when is this going to happen? The very last verse says, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations." So there's this notion of this inheriting the nations. Where have we heard that before? Well, Psalm 2, "As for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill." Ooh, that's Messiah, isn't it? "I said, you are my son. Today I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations as your heritage, and you will rule them with a rod of iron." So he's referring to Messiah here. And he uses the term arise, which in the Greek version, it's aneste, which is the word that Paul uses to describe the resurrection of Christ. So Paul will take passages in the Old Testament that use that word arise related to God or Messiah, and he says that's the resurrection. All right. So he does that, for example, in Romans 15:12. Look it up. And he says when the Old Testament is using arise or raising up a standard, that's a reference to the resurrection. So this is a resurrecting God, who's Messiah, who will inherit the nations. Well, what does that mean? What that means is all that inheritance and allotment that God gave to these fallen sons of God, Messiah will take it away from them. He will disinherit them. Imagine it like God gave them territorial deeds to land. And when Messiah comes, he's going to resurrect from the dead. And through his resurrection, he's going to take back the territorial deeds of all the nations. And then let's see if I've got this down here.
I was just looking
You said
at
Romans 15:12.
Yeah, and I just read that. I decided the New English translation to be the Net Bible will be the best for this. And again, Isaiah says, "The root of Jesse will come, and the one who rises to rule over the Gentiles. In him will the Gentiles hope." And then it's like, oh, this is a quotation from Isaiah, and I go to Isaiah because, of course, I have to, because that's how my brain works. At that time, a root from Jesse will stand like a signal flag for the nations. Nations will look to him for guidance, and his residence will be majestic.
Yes. Now, there's a lot of different theological things to talk about there, but I'm just making the point of realize that Paul uses this Old Testament. When the Old Testament says arise, it wasn't saying resurrection, but Paul is saying it was. And so from that pattern, I think it's very clear that this is messianic, Psalm 82. And if we make that same connection, I think we're going to see that. But the inheritance of the nations, what I'm getting at is, that's when Messiah disinherits all the others. So what do you see in the Old Testament? You see the nations are blinded, right? Jesus says the God of this world has blinded the eyes of the unbelieving, and they're in bondage, right? He who sins is in bondage to sin. And the concept of the Jews was you're either a Jew, God's chosen people, or you're a sinner. There's no that was their understanding. The idea being that all the Gentile nations are in darkness. In fact, I don't know the passage, but there's a passage that talks about Jesus will come, Messiah will come in Galilee, and something about he will bring light to the darkness of the Gentiles, right? And so the idea there is that Gentiles are in darkness and in bondage to what? To their sin, but more importantly, to these authorities over them who are their gods, their false gods. And so when Messiah comes, the concept is he will disinherit those. And now what does, I don't have the passages I should, but what does Revelation say? People of every tribe and tongue and nation shall come to him, right? Go and preach the gospel to all, disciple all the nations, all those nations that were in bondage. Because Jesus rose from the dead, he now has all authority and power on heaven and earth, meaning he took the authority that was once in the hands of those watchers. He now has that authority. They don't have it anymore. They're disinherited. They have been judged because of his resurrection. In his resurrection, he judges them. He takes away those deeds. And now that's why you hear the gospel is always described as to every tribe and tongue and nation and people from all, Acts 2, men from all tongue, from all over the, from all nation and different tongues and such are coming into the kingdom of God because they're no longer in bondage to those watchers, to those territorial powers or whatever. So this is why when Paul talks about principalities and powers, that's a whole nother study.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not earthly powers. Yeah, earthly powers are connected because the earthly power has heavenly powers. But if you read, like Ephesians 5, it's very clear that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but heavenly powers, principalities of darkness. So you ask yourself, well, wait a minute. That was written by Paul after Christ resurrected and ascended. So doesn't that discount what you're saying? No, actually, it doesn't. It actually reinforces the notion that Paul wrote it in the time period of the 40-year generation before the fall of Jerusalem. And the fall of Jerusalem was the destruction of the temple. What was the temple? The temple was the incarnation of the old covenant. If the new covenant had come with the ascension, death and resurrection and ascension of Christ, but the old covenant temple wasn't destroyed for another 40 years. What you have is what I call a transition period between covenants. Yes, the new covenant has begun, but it's what the book of Revelation, book of Hebrews actually talks about, where it says, in speaking, Hebrews 8:13, in speaking of the new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. The old covenant is made obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. It hasn't vanished yet. It's growing old. It's becoming obsolete, even though it's already obsolete. What does that mean? It means the new covenant made the old obsolete, but until the temple was destroyed, which is what Hebrews is all about, the temple, right? Until the earthly temple is destroyed, it's sort of, it's made obsolete, but it's still here, so it's becoming obsolete. And when it's destroyed is the final consummation of the kingdom of God brought in by Jesus Christ, and that final consummation of his promises. And so, yes, during the time of Paul and Book of Acts and all that, we still have these watchers. There still are these territorial powers that they're wrestling against, even though they've been legally disinherited by Christ until the old covenant is destroyed. Why? Because the old covenant is the thing that the powers are rooted in. So even though the new covenant is coming in, the old covenant's been done away spiritually. God is not a God of philosophy and abstract theology. He's a God of history. So there's two components. There's the spiritual and the heavenly and the earthly. So yes, the heavenly, Hebrews talks about the heavenly redemption has taken place and the kingdom has arrived, and the heavenly temple is there. But until the earthly temple is destroyed, there's still that residue of the old covenant. But when that earthly temple is destroyed, the old covenant is finally publicly and earthly, right? Certainly publicly eliminated that we can then say, okay, now it's completely done. In fact, in Hebrews, that same passage, or chapter 9, a little further on, he says, look, it's talking about the Holy Spirit indicates verse 9, chapter 9, verse 8, the Holy Spirit indicates the way into the holy place is not yet open. He's talking about heaven, the temple in heaven. And then he says the first section, or if you read it in context, the first section means the earthly temple is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. So 40-year time period where the ages are overlapping, the old age is dying out and it's going to be eliminated, and the new age is blending in. And so it's a historically, volatile, confused mixture of covenants, so to speak, right? Because God operates historically and publicly, not just theologically and abstractly. So we have to be careful of making absolutes about spiritual truths, because there's both a public aspect as well as, or I like to say, an earthly aspect as well as a heavenly, because the New Testament talks a lot about earthly and heavenly, that kind of thing. So Christ is reigning on the throne in heaven right now, and his kingdom has been inaugurated, and the consummation of that inauguration occurred at the destruction of the temple. So, and that's why I make the argument that, in my book, Psalm 82, that the resurrection of Christ, disinherits the watchers, and their judgment is made sure at that point. But Jesus inherits the nation when the gospel goes forth. And once the gospel goes forth, no Gentiles are under the authority or powers of those watchers anymore. They can't be. Otherwise, the gospel wouldn't go forth, right? And so by the time that when the old covenant temple is finally destroyed, the old covenant and everything is publicly done away with. And so we now have that the combination of heaven and earth, consummation, inauguration and consummation, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's really one of those, like, I've not heard someone speak of, the destruction of the temple in AD 70,
yeah,
as a end of the physical manifestation of the old covenant. That's actually super interesting, and I'm gonna have to.
Yeah, that's a whole. Yeah, I didn't realize. I've done so many podcasts, I forget what I talked about on which podcast with who. So I apologize for that. But
no, you're good.
But that would be a whole nother discussion we can have on another. That needs to be had, because there's much delusion going on in the Christian world, and what Christians read in the Bible as the last days, they assume, because of their own modern bias, the word last days, well, that must be the last days of earth, but it doesn't. It means the last days of the old covenant. And if you study in context, it's clearly what it means. Yeah, and that's a whole discussion. So
one of the neat things that I picked up while you're talking is, it's so interesting that the ancient church is cued in on the types of things that you're talking about, because they didn't read a Masoretic text Old Testament. They read a Septuagint Old Testament. And what does Septuagint 32:8 say? It says he divided the nations according to the numbers of his angels. And so what you see is that so there's this idea of the Greek term theanthropos, the fully God, fully man. And you see that the ancient church didn't even, modern Christian readers would be very shocked to see some of the ancient church say, we will become gods. They're saying we're going to be made the sons of God. And they believe that sanctification is the process of what? Theosis. We are becoming like Christ through Christ. And that's and so it's so interesting to see.
Excellent point you bring up, because that's the next step in this discussion. We've been talking about the sons of God. We did at least shallowly address the fact that Jesus is the only Son of God. I mean, we addressed that. The unique Son of God doesn't mean only Son, but even if the words only Son are there, as you mentioned as well, that Hebrews 11:17 says Isaac was Abraham's only son when he wasn't. Ishmael was. So only son meant his unique son.
Yeah.
And so when it says Jesus is the unique Son of God, he is one of the sons of God. But of course, most Christians, oh, that's shocking. No, you're saying he's just just like everyone else. He's not God. No, he is God. Here's the difference. Remember, the Elohim inhabit that spiritual realm. So sons of God are inhabitants of the spiritual realm. Jesus is one of the sons of God, but he's the unique son of God in that all the other sons of God are created. Jesus is not. He is the God himself, right? And remember the Trinity? I'm an Orthodox Trinitarian. So he is the unique son of God in that he's one of those sons of God, but he is God himself in the flesh. But what's the point of that? Here's the point. By him coming to earth, attaining our atonement, redemption, etc., the New Testament, and this was originally a problem with me because I thought the New Testament talks a lot about Christians are sons of God. Galatians 3:26, in Christ Jesus, you are all sons of God through faith, right? Romans 8:14, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Right. And it says, we are adopted as sons. We are children of God. So the concept of sons and children are equivalents or what's the word? Interchangeable, right? With sons of God. But the idea is you are sons of God. And is that, Brian, I thought you said that was a technical term that only meant those divine heavenly beings. Well, here's the point is, Romans 8:18, I consider sufferings of this present time nothing compared to the glory that is to be revealed to us at the revealing of the sons of God. And then this glory has this shining nature to it, right? And when Colossians 3:4, when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Look up glory. Glory is a twofold meaning. It means, the glory of God is his majesty and his reputation and his fame, right? But it's often accompanied by literally, or it's symbolically, but sometimes literally, shining, right?
Like Moses.
Yeah, exactly. When Moses went before God, he came out, he shone, and they had to hide their eyes, right? So sometimes and the transfiguration, right? And so the Bible says that we will be like him, Jesus, right? And but then but wait, the Bible says we are already sons of God. Well, this is the now and the not yet concept, right? And so in a very real sense, we are. So the whole goal of it is, I think you're right that the Orthodox have something right here, and typical evangelicals are fearful because it sounds odd. This deification. Well, when they say deification, they don't mean like we're going to become gods like Mormons.
Yeah,
Mormons try to twist that, by the way.
Yeah,
and they try to cherry pick that piece of the history, but it doesn't work.
They also think that Elohim is a proper name for the father of Jesus, who is Jehovah, and his father was. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. So,
what's the now and the not yet concept?
Right. Matthew 22:30. For in the resurrection, they will be like angels in heaven. How are angels in heaven described? We go to tons of verses, right? At Sinai, God came forth shining with his angels, flaming with fire to present the law. So angels in heaven are shining and glorified. Well, we will be glorified fully in the resurrection. We're not shining now, are we? No. That's the now and the not yet. But in a very real sense, though, we are sons of God right here and now, and it's not yet appeared what we will be. So there's a transformation that the resurrection brings about, which would, be best said that our bodies will fully manifest what is already true in us in the heavenly realm, right? So the earthly realm will manifest the heavenly realm. There it is again. And so there's a sense in which, this is why I believe that Daniel 12 says that there will be many who sleep in the dust will wake to everlasting life, some to everlasting contempt. That's the glory element. And then he says, the wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky and like the stars forever and ever. This shining like stars is this deification, because we will become like God, not in the sense that we're gods or like him or anything like that. It's just we partake of the divine nature now. Well, then the transformation will be complete through the resurrection. We will have the resurrected body, which will be the divine nature like the sons of God have. So the goal of this all is God has wanted to build his family. That's why he uses the word sons, right? His family. It's not just a kingdom of power. It's also a family. And the sons of God concept is the people he created. His goal is to ultimately make them divine beings who worship him forever before his throne. So there is a divinity that will come upon us. And this is not a divinity this is a divinity like the Orthodox talk about, all right? It's not we're gods and we can create things or anything like that, but it's certainly when you are in the presence of God and you've been transformed to be like the body of Christ, it says our bodies will become like his body, right? There's going to be something very different about us, but it's also divine. And the point is the divinity will be like the divinity of the sons of God. They're not God. They're not eternal or, the Son. They're not like the Trinity, but they are those who dwell in that realm and have the immortality and worship of God forever. So that's kind of the end of the story. Where we're getting to is that the sons of God that we are, that concept in the New Testament is, I believe it's connected to that sons of God in the Old Testament. We are to become those beings fully when our sin is sloughed off and we are resurrected. But we are already have their essence, or how shall we say it? We already have their identity as sons of God. It just hasn't been completed fully because our bodies still have sin in them. But when they are resurrected and they are transformed, then it will be complete, and we will have that sense of divinity, divine beings, right? Not we won't be Jesus in the literal sense, right?
Right.
But anyway.
Wait, already but not yet is one of my favorite concepts because it's actually a way I've described myself and how I view the world in a lot of ways. I mean, I think a lot of Christians do. I don't know if they think of it quite the way I do, or Zach does, or Brian does. But like it's like we're talking about, like if we were talking about right now, I'm a part of the kingdom of God. I am an active member of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is already here, but it's not yet in its fullness. We are not in the presence of God. The heaven and earth have not been made one yet. So it's happening, but we're not to the end yet. So we're transitional beings at this point.
It's
That's
a
how
wonderful.
I've understood it.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It's a wonderful encouragement when we think about Paul talking about this, when he says, "For he that began a good work in you will complete it before the second coming." So again, that's another reflection on that now, but not yet. It's a wonderful encouragement because we as Christians, we get so dour on ourselves every time we fall short. But when we fall short and we're dour, that's a wonderfully positive sign because it means we are marching away from the old man. We are already, we've been made the sons of God through the Son of God, and we are becoming more like him all the time.
Very well put. This is why the biblical concept of the old man, new man is we do still have the old man in us, but the old man is dead. Well, this is the conundrum, but the theological truth is we still have sin in us, so that's referred to as the old man, but theologically speaking, heavenly speaking, that old man is dead and you have a new man, and you can put that old man to death. Even though he's already dead, he still fights to take, it's the two dogs, but the point of it is like, I like what you're saying because it emphasizes the biblical concept is that our victory in this life, and I've done a study on this, which sometimes I think I need to go back and redo it, but understanding I think there's a curriculum called the Sons of God or something like that, where it makes this point that our victory in this life is achieved through practically realizing that whatever problems our issues are, whether it's an addiction, whether it's a sin, whether it's whatever, your issues that you're struggling with, well, what psychological theory do we follow to overcome them, right? Well, actually, the biblical version is to understand that those sins, those problems are part of the old man that's now dead. Your identity is new in Christ. Doesn't mean you're living it out or experiencing it, but the identity you have, which is interesting because, today, identity is an idol, right? It's identity of self-creation. And so I have what's your gender identity, your sexual identity, right? So it's a very interesting how they worship false idols that are kind of rooted in truth. But our identity as the children of God and new men, and we are cleansed and forgiven, etc. That's the course through which we live out and experience that which is already spiritually true of us. And it's by recognizing this is not my identity. My identity is in Christ. My identity is in his perfection as a son of God. And therefore I don't need to be this lowly being that is dominating me, you know? And so that's sort of the root of, I think, in my own life, wherever I do have those victories, is, you know, we don't overcome by our hard efforts necessarily. Life requires hard effort, but we're not going to save ourselves or redeem ourselves from our problems, practically speaking. Obviously, spiritually speaking, only Christ can save us. But even practically speaking, we can't do it of our own accord unless we recognize the spiritual truth that Christ has done for us, and that's where we get that ability to overcome. We are sons of God, but yet it's not been revealed yet what we will be. And so you can fight this addiction. You can fight this depression or whatever. And that's the pathway I think that you need to take.
That's a beautiful word. That's so true.
Well, I think that's what's really cool about the already but not yet is, you know, we are these imperfect beings who are still dealing with our sin, who are still dealing with our brokenness. But when God looks at us, he sees the righteousness of Christ. So we are covered and we're still growing and we're still becoming more like Christ. But when he looks at us, he sees his son.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I mean, there's an extreme of that. I think there's extremes that are false in the church, right? Which is these sort of dominionist sort of mentality of this, you know, I'm a child of God, I'm a son of God, and I command it, and all this stuff. And it's like, well, they're taking one truthful element and they're idolizing it into a victory based on the negation of the other side of the reality. And a true humble truth is, yes, we have that identity and victory in Christ, but it's done for us. It's not something we command, and we still wrestle against the old man. The old man, the flesh, is still a part of us, and you will not have victory unless you have a humble recognition of that. If you deny that, you're going to go off into delusion. You know, just like the opposite side of those who just focus on woe is me and, you know, we are sinfuls and whatever, you know.
God is wrathful.
Yeah,
period. It's all wrath.
Again, these are truthful things, but if you ignore the fact that, but we are children of God, you know, we are the king's kids, you know, all these phrases I've heard throughout my life, but they're true. But in context, you have that proper balance. Then you have the humility, yet the victory.
Yeah, well, it's like one of my close friends became Christian, came to Christ a couple of years ago, and I was having a conversation with her a year or so ago, and she was like, you know, I'm undeserving, I'm unworthy, I'm a sinner, and I'm like, quit claiming that stuff, man. He made you worthy. He made you deserving.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? You were not a sinner anymore. You were claiming this on your life. I'm not doing the name or claiming thing. I'm just saying the identities that you choose come to fruition.
A lot of the things, when people go too hard on that, they forget that the worthiest price that heaven could pay was paid for you.
Yeah.
So you are worthy. You might be deserving of hell, but Christ paid for you. So,
or as I would put it, you've been made worthy or declared worthy. You're not worthy, but you've been declared. That's reckoned righteousness. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. It's like, you know, he has given you the gift of righteousness, and you better hold on to that.
Yeah.
Because
and like you said,
if you're holding on to the old stuff, that's no good.
But when he sees you, he sees Christ, and that's like, wow. Because I wouldn't have a chance if he didn't. You mentioned the cloak of Christ's righteousness. I don't know the passages, but there are Bible passages that describe that, and we wear the cloak of Christ over us. And man, yeah, I need that because I wouldn't have a chance if I didn't. There it is. That's why the sons of God and the divine council is not just an arbitrary theological construct for us to debate who love theology and getting into esoteric phenomena, but it actually is a theological thread that connects to our redemption as God's people.
That's right.
And can be understood in a way that builds your relationship with God, you know?
Mm.
And what I love
Wow.
is, if you look at the first century, the Second Temple period, and those who were waiting on the Messiah, they saw a very different Messiah coming their way.
Yeah.
They saw a full-grown man riding on the back of a white horse with a sword, delivering them from Rome when it was a baby born in a stable. It's I mean, like that's what's, and I talked about this a little bit before the show. That's what's so beautiful about this is, regardless of how much the enemy has tried to pervert the will of God and the plans of God, and they use sin, they use darkness, they use evil. God, like it talks about in the story of Joseph. What you intended for evil, God used for good. He subverts every evil move of his enemy to do good. What's Zach? Remind me of that verse. I'm sure you know which verse I'm thinking of. Gosh, all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose.
That's right.
And all things,
evil,
all things,
yes,
are used by God to create good. And I love that.
I think that's a great place to end because, that's where this all leads to. And what more can we possibly say?
Nothing on that, but I do.
That's my hint that I'm done.
I do have some questions for you though.
Okay.
Such as when David brought that bag to Saul, the way you wrote it, it wasn't just the bride price that Saul had requested for his daughter Michal, the 100 foreskins. David brought 200, but in your writing, it wasn't just the skins; it was a full castration. How big was that bag? You imagine? Because 200. What was Saul holding on to?
Oh man!
Because after all, I figured, I try to be consistent. If I come up with some different perspective, I still try to be consistent. My premise there was, well, the foreskins are on the penises, so it's like,
right.
It would be accurate to say he brought the foreskins, Yeah.
I mean, if I were having to do something so disgusting, I wouldn't want to do the surgical precision needed to just do that part. Like, here, let me just get this thing. No.
Yeah. It's like on a dead person or something, It's just, a warrior's just gonna. That's the other reason why I did that, because I'm like, more realistically speaking, that would. In other words, saying he brought a bag of foreskins would be the polite way of saying what it really consisted of.
Can I just say, I love that your choice when writing about David bringing it to Saul was at the dinner table. Just beautiful choice. I love that decision.
By the way, everyone, he's talking about the book David Ascendant, which is book 7.
Chronicles
of Nephilim.
I never once ever pictured him using like a cigar trimmer. I mean, he was a warrior. It's not going to be like he's not pulling a straight razor out of his boot. It's going to be.
Oh Lord.
Yeah.
It'll be sharp, but it'll. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just I just do want to say, I've really enjoyed listening to you read and reading myself your books. Like I said, I don't want to spoil things for people, but you seem to get excited when I mentioned Ittai the Gittite, because I
loved him. He's one of my favorite characters.
I was genuinely hoping you would hit that point, that understanding in the story, and I was like, thank God.
And the reason why I think you like is the same reason why I like him was the more complex a character is, the more interesting they are. And when you have a character who's got two strong competing, values,
natures,
or issues, that they're struggling with, it's like, and of course, the implication I draw is the possibility that he may be Nephilim, of some
Yeah.
kind. And so can the Nephilim be saved? That's the whole question, and I didn't have like an absolute answer. I struggled through the story with it.
Yeah.
And my goal was to just address that complex issue, and to do so honestly. And I think that's what interests you, what interests people. Same thing with Rahab. My Rahab character. She's my favorite character in my whole series, and her experience and her issues were very complex because she was a pagan who ended up believing. But it's like, how did she get there?
Yeah.
And yeah.
There was also you played with the concept earlier on. I want to say it was Enoch Primordial, when you had what was his name, Uya, one of the Nephilim that was helping.
Oh yeah, Aya and Oya.
Right, Oya. You played with that concept, but it was a diversion. So he wasn't real, and I was just like, I wanted to hear what he thought. Dadgummit. And so I was like waiting for it.
Do you know I got the name Haya and Oya, or I can't remember exactly how you spell, but those were actually based on actual names of Nephilim in some Dead Sea Scroll material. So I actually use names that I got from actual texts. That's kind of cool.
So like we hit the main points, and like I said, I do want. What's so funny is now I know that people are reading your books as well, and so I can talk to them. But it was really funny was like the only person I have to talk about these books with is the author, so I'm going to send him a message.
Oh my Lord!
What the heck? What the heck?
Oh.
Love, and it's so like, what was the Caleb Vigilant? That book, I think that may be my favorite of the series. I think so far, because the Rahab storyline, Caleb, the way you
and
work
Caleb, I love Caleb too. It's like he's so cool,
Man, everyone should read these so that we can talk about them. And I'm not going, oh, spoiler. It's in the Bible, what happens. But
something I was telling Brian just before we started is like I've looked into some of your writings, and I was watching some of his awesome lectures. They're awesome. Check them out. The whole motivation for
Godawa.
me to get a Kindle, the whole motivation for me to get a Kindle is so I can check out Brian's writings. So they're so cool. If you're a Bible nerd at all, and even if you're not, you should really check them out. I think Whip has some good.
Speaking of which, all my books, almost every one of my books is on ebook, audiobook, and paperback. Some are also in hardcover exclusively on Amazon, because
links are in the description, by the way.
Okay, great. And
thank you.
Yeah, and you can just go direct to Amazon because it's all exclusively there. Or if you go to my website, Godawa.com, that's my store on Godawa.com, has lectures and online courses that aren't on Amazon. But you can also find a lot of helpful information, like a lot of free articles. And also, I cast most of my novels where I actually have little pictures and descriptions of characters that are kind of cool. And some people don't want to see it, but I like searching for characters in like stock photos and stuff. And it's amazing what's available out there nowadays. And I find characters that I think embody the characters I'm thinking that I wrote. So you can find all kinds of helpful stuff on Godawa.com, Godawa.com.
Well, here's my question. It's a big one. And then we can let Whip loose on all of the things that he's written down. Where do you think Mastema is now? Because I haven't gotten to the Jesus storyline yet. Mastema is one of the names of the Satan.
Yes.
Where do you think he is right now? Do you think he's bound?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I definitely think he's bound. But what does binding mean? And there are different ways of binding. In Enoch, and even Jude, talks about them being imprisoned and bound in the earth, like in Hades or in Tartarus, actually, which is the lowest part of Hades and such. The angels from the flood, right?
Yeah, where the Titans are.
But that's not always what it means. And you have to always remember, whenever the Bible's talking about symbolically, and it is symbolic in Revelation 20, you have to take it into context. And in context, it says what the binding is. It says Satan is bound that he may not deceive the nations. So the binding is his inability to deceive the nations. Does that mean that he's still around? Sure. Why couldn't he be? Remember, everything I said was the gospel We use the word gospel all the time. Gospel, gospel. What is the gospel? Well, the gospel is the story, the good news of salvation through Messiah, through Christ, right? What is that? Well, I pretty much explained the Christus Victor motif. There's many different ways of understanding the atonement, but
Yeah.
and I accept, substitutionary sacrifice and all that, but the Christus Victor motif is his victory over the powers, right? And so, and that's what we've been talking about. And what that says is, what did I say? The nations were in bondage. The nations were in bondage to these watchers, but then Messiah, Jesus, through his resurrection, he disinherited them,
Yep.
took away. So the Gentiles are no longer in bondage. They cannot be deceived by Satan like they were in the Old Testament when everyone else was going to hell and it's just Israel. But now God says, I save people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation. No, so the binding of, I see that the strongest way of understanding that Satan is bound there is that the gospel, because of the gospel, because of the resurrection and ascension of Christ, Satan can no longer hold humankind, human beings, in bondage under the old covenant of watchers, right? That now he can't deceive the nations. So the nations can now come to Christ through the gospel, and that's what's happening. So
And there's an awesome
Yeah.
quote from Jesus about that, because when the strong man owns the house, his goods are secure. But when a stronger than he comes and binds him and plunders the house of his goods, so that's
And that's
Christ
what Jesus was
plundering the nations through the
Exactly.
resurrection, through the incarnation and the resurrection.
Absolutely. And so, so by that, now I'm not settled on all my beliefs on this, because Revelation 20 is very confusing and complex, and no theologians agree. And the smart ones will admit that, we really don't know because there's so many problems with every view. But, where I currently stand on that is, it seems to me that could still be going on now. That Satan was bound at the beginning of Christ's ministry. And so Revelations 20, people talk about the millennium and all that. And basically that Satan is bound now. And so to some degree, Revelation 20 is already beginning and already happening in that sense, with the gospel going forth. Now, did that occur recently? Well, I think it occurred in the New Testament. So the new covenant, that's when that all that stuff began. So what happens after that? That's a whole nother debate.
Gotcha.
But binding always understand things in the context of what they're saying.
Oh, one last thing. This is going to sound weird, but I was sad when Azazel was bound, because that was such a great antagonist.
Yeah. He was like my Hans Land. What's the guy in Glorious Bastards? He was like, oh man. Yeah, he was my favorite villain to write too, because he was, the Hannibal Lecter of the Watchers and all that.
And I'm now reading Jezebel, and I see Ishtar is there, and I'm like, what's happening right now? Because last I checked,
So the premise there is that, don't forget that I said this earlier too, that my premise is that there isn't a one-to-one correspondence, and they're deceiving, they're playing characters. So the Baal of one time eras doesn't have to be the Baal of the next time era, and sometimes they may be, right, if they're not been bound in prison, but they're playing characters. So someone takes when Ashtart is bound or whatever, someone will take her place.
All I'm saying is my hopes got high, because I was like, is my favorite villain back? And I'm like, I know she's bound, or he, she. I love the underpinnings of that choice.
Yeah. No, I wanted to stay true to the concept of Enoch, at least, until the judgment. However, if you read my series, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, that is where I believe she's released. So,
ooh.
Wait,
I will.
When did that happen? Or is that happening in the future? You'll have to read my series to find out. But Chronicles of the Apocalypse is a standalone series. It's about the origin story of the book of Revelation. So I'm telling the story of Nero persecuting the Christians, Paul and Peter being martyred, all that stuff going on around the 60s that leads to the Jewish revolt and the destruction of the temple. And at that time, John is writing Book of Revelation. And yes, there are different theories of when it was written. And I believe it was written around the 60s. So, and there's lots of evidence for that. Most Christians just like gobble up whatever they're told, and they don't look at all the varying scholarly arguments for things, and they don't realize that, nobody knows for sure. But there's plenty of great arguments that it was written in the 60s, not in the time of Domitian later on. But my point is I'm telling that story of like, well, what would it be like in that time period when he's writing it? And don't forget, it's apocalyptic. So just like Daniel, it's like he's writing what's going to happen, but they're being persecuted. So he's writing in code language.
It's a contemporary meaning.
Yeah.
And also a long range meaning.
Right. And so what does that mean? Well, that probably means my fictional story is Nero hears about this subversive insurrection document. So he sends a guy out to track it down. And the Christians are like cutting it up and sending it to different churches and stuff and trying to keep it hidden, these letters, and which is Revelation. And so that's sort of the premise of my explanation of how might the Jews of the first century understood Revelation at that time. And so it's definitely a different take, like it's nothing you've ever read before, actually. It's not theologically new, but it's certainly dramatically new in terms of no one's written novels like this.
So it's not Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins stuff.
No. I like to tell people it's you read about how people think about Revelation, how it's going to happen. Well, this is the origin story of so let's look at the story of when John wrote it, and that I'll just leave it at that. And because you know what, you don't have to agree with my eschatology to enjoy the book. I've got many people who said, I don't agree with your theology, but I really like the books. They're great reading, and you'll learn a lot about biblical prophecy because I communicate a lot of how the ancient Jews understood prophecy, and you'll learn a lot reading and a lot of history because it's a time period that many Christians don't know much about, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It's very crucial to Jewish theology and to Christian theology, and many Christians don't know much about it. So I want to bring a lot of history into the package as well, and so hopefully it does a good job.
All right, Whip, what you got?
Okay. What's the Apkallu? Are those the things? Did I say that right? From
Yes,
the
you did.
Sumerian tablets. Okay.
So
And you called them. You mentioned fish heads, maybe.
No, men in fish suits.
Men in fish suits, right? Okay. And that's where I was gonna take that. Like, what are your thoughts? Do you think the fish suits were maybe like I don't know, like a spacesuit? A spacesuit would be the word I'm thinking of. Yeah. And also the relation in those Sumerian tablets with the purses to the same dudes with the purses found all over on all the monoliths, on many of the monoliths around the world. And then you mentioned also the serpent. You mentioned like this all kind of right around the same time. That's why I wrote it close. So you mentioned the serpent change in Judaism. Prior it was like wisdom. It was connected to the earth. It was nature. And then flip get script, and all of a sudden this thing is just evil, right? Like you just better watch out. And then so like, what do you think about that? Like then all of a sudden being connected to that wisdom in some way is taking away your connection to God. And then like, why do you think that change in the symbology happened? And do you see parallels to that in the modern day?
So
that's like my big one.
Yeah. So only thing I remember is Apkallu. So Apkallu.
Okay, we'll start there.
There's a great article by Anus. I can't remember his name. His last name is Anus, Annus, and you can find any of his articles probably online somewhere. But
spell it right.
I'm going to find it because it is a crucial article for those who want to learn about this stuff. It's one of the most important articles. Michael Heiser says you have to know this material if you're going to talk about the Watchers.
Anus.
Amar Anus, yeah.
On the origin
and it's
of
called
Watchers.
On the Origin of the Watchers, a comparative study. And you can probably find it for free. It's on my website. I know that. So
Good talk.
he roots a lot of that in the Mesopotamian understanding of the Watchers are rooted in the Apkallu of the Mesopotamia, and the Apkallu were these wise ones, you know, that heavenly origin, and they brought the wisdom to man, and they,
Prometheus.
yeah, yeah. So, and there's a lot more to that. That I mean, I don't know as much as others do on that, but so that's the concept there, and a lot of, I think most ancient Near Eastern religions have that concept of given knowledge from the gods, you know,
Yeah.
to some degree, and so this is the polemical nature of, because, you know, Moses was raised in Egypt and he was educated, so he learned. I mean, he was shortly after Hammurabi, so he and they Egypt traded with Babylon and stuff, so he knew a lot of these stories and narratives and stuff, and so I think that you know, whatever his understanding was, he was one of the components of what he was communicating was what you think are these. Because okay, number one premise: Yahweh is the one true God, and worship Him alone. You know, I am the Lord your God. Worship me alone. There shall be no other gods before me. Okay, so that's the prime. You know, the Shema is the primary definer of Judaism, which means everything else is wrong in a sense, right? Religiously, at least, right? And
Sure.
so you have to understand those, that a lot of Genesis is polemical reactions to what was considered knowledge. You know, now and so so what they're saying is that what you think is received wisdom from the gods is actually demonic and destructive, because you're not worshiping Yahweh. Yahweh alone is the source of our truth, you know? And so the other component of that would be the garden, the snake, I mean, the serpent. And now I think in later, there's, like, if you look at Gnosticism is a post-Christian. I mean, it was, you know, there was it was bubbling and boiling in the first century, but it wasn't until like the second century before Gnosticism became a sort of organized religion. Of course, there's always been mystic religions, but Gnosticism in particular says Satan brought wisdom, and because God was jealous, and Satan's wisdom actually, it was a what did they call that? A tragic but good thing. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it brought our punishment from God, from the garden, but it was a good thing because we needed that wisdom, and God's jealous of it. You know, so that's a post-Christian concept. But even before, you know, even before the days of, you know, Moses and such, you know, in general, there's a book out called The Good and Evil Serpent by books. I'm gonna get this. Oh, I don't have that. Okay. Let me see if I got serpent in there. I don't have it there. So
one of the things that I found interesting was you brought in and discredited within your books the Lilith mythology, because I think that plays well into what we're talking about in some ways. It's a twisting of, I mean, obviously Genesis is polemic, but that was what it's fighting against, is the type of stories like Lilith where it's just a weird pre-feminist feminism.
yeah.
And I'll, by the way, your I was just gonna say your heavenly court scenes are fascinating, and I love
Cool.
my favorite. Well, I mean, I do think that Rahab's my favorite character outside of Malak Yahweh.
So is it The Good and Evil Serpent by James H. Charlesworth?
That's it. I was looking for. I thought I had that thing in my PDF files, and I guess I don't. The Good and Evil Serpent.
Because we see in a way Jesus' reversal of that through the bronze serpent.
Yes.
So that's kind of I think I haven't read the book, But that's
But what's good about that book is Charles Worth goes into all the ancient notions of this, and it's rooted in, obviously, in archaeological. So it's more of a scholarly study, than some of these books out there that people put out. They're just ridiculous. They're just researchers. Which I mean, I'm in that category too. So I've got to be careful. But I try to everything that I write, I try to base it. I footnote, to show that I'm not just like freewheeling, running around. I'm rooting this stuff in what scholars are arguing. I try to do that, even though I'm not one of them in that sense. But yeah,
Man,
so
I
Charles,
love a good footnote.
yeah, I'm a total footnote reader, so that's why I do footnotes in all mine. And so Charles Worth writes about that. That's where I got a lot of understanding too about how the ancient serpent was considered often positive, not always, but because there's also Leviathan, and Leviathan was a sea serpent, and that was negative. And Apophis in Egypt, he was a bad guy. He was the serpent that fought Ra as he's trying to get his boat to go across the heavens with the sun. And so, so it's surely sometimes negative, but I mean, the serpent as there were serpent cults in Canaan and all this. So yeah, that's definitely there's definitely a polemical element to that for sure. But I tell you, the serpent is a deep one because it goes throughout the whole thing all the way to the end, and seed of the serpent and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, and then what else were you asking?
I was just going to throw in there one of the things that I thought was really good by John H. Walton is he was talking about in the Garden of Eden, the deception, the choice they made. He had said, I'd never thought of this before. He said he believes that the wisdom of that fruit was something God was going to prepare man for and give to him to be a part of him, that wisdom. But by choosing it too early and usurping his role as the decider of what is good and what is evil, they jumped the gun, and that's why we are where we are. I've never thought of it that. Like, why I never thought, this was a good thing. He didn't just put a bad thing in the garden. This was a good thing that he was planning on sharing with us, but we weren't ready for.
And think about it. Isn't that a common theme throughout the whole Old Testament? Right? We were already talking about this. Jacob, instead of doing it the right way, he grabs for his own way.
Goes back to the already but not yet.
Yeah, Abraham and Sarah. Well, we got to do it. I got to use Hagar. Got to do God's will my way. So it's a very common theme, I think. Absolutely.
And so
we're trying to pick the peaches before they're ripe.
Yeah.
What were you guys saying about fish people, though? Was there a question?
The fish people thing. No, I haven't looked at anything about the purses and stuff. I know what you're talking about in the Assyrian engravings, but I haven't looked into that. But the fish wing is it's more like a fish suit. And no, I don't personally believe in the ancient aliens theory, so I don't think it has anything to do with spacesuits for sure. But because the symbolism, I mean, when you study the iconography of Assyrian religion, it's all symbolic. So it's like, why would it be literal? Because everything's symbolic there, So I just think that the ancient aliens thing is just so silly.
I never actually okay, so for me, Ancient Aliens was always like the limited hangout version of what it probably was, right?
Yeah.
Like, I never thought it was a spacesuit. That's like something I use for lack of a better term. Just like, it's technology. It's just some way of demonstrating technology.
Sure.
Because
separation.
Sure.
Meaning like the priests and the wise ones were separated from the shore.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
not much more than that I've looked into.
Okay, cool. All right. And then let's see, what did I have here? Also, I wrote your website down, so that's good.
Godawa.com.
I got it, buddy. Have you ever read the book Job, A Comedy of Errors?
No.
It's a Heinlein book. It's a great book. It's fabulous. Yeah, it's really fun.
Heinlein?
Heinlein, yeah. And
I saw also during the thing when I heard us use words, and I saw whip look like, what's that word mean? I put it on the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Exegesis. Cool. Totally appreciated that one.
Since I wouldn't shut up.
No. It was great though, because I didn't want to interrupt the flow. I was like, oh, I'm just going to sound retarded because I don't know this word.
That was great,
Okay.
Graham. I'm glad you did that.
So this is a war against principalities and powers. Where's that from?
Ephesians. I think
Ephesians 6:12.
6, but then the cross references to that. There's a lot of cross references. Let me see if I think I've got them on my fingertips for you that I can throw some out there for you in the New Testament.
I was going to say, and it's funny that Psalm 82, it puts
There it
quotations around gods in the NIV, which I think is it's even worse than what the ESV did.
Oh
They
yeah.
changed it to judges. The
Oh.
freaking NIV goes gods.
Oh,
Yeah. So Ephesians 3:10 is what the introduction. It goes throughout Ephesians where he's talking about the rulers and authorities and stuff, but that's where it first starts talking about it. Then Ephesians 4:8-10 is when Christ ascends, and then 6:12 is the wrestle not, and that's against the spiritual forces of evil. Then Colossians 2:15 where he disarms the rulers and authorities, and that's not earthly ones. And then that's what I got right now. There's more, but I don't have them at my fingertips.
Well, the reason that this is a war against principalities and powers, struck a chord with me is that I do a lot of screen recording for dumb edits and stuff. And Dame mentioned an album, and it's called Presage, and it's from like 1998, and it talks like a whole bunch of weird conspiracy stuff, but like one track. So like the tracks often start with like a narrator type voice, and he says something blah blah blah, and then they kind of go on from there. And one of the tracks starts with him saying, "This is a war against principalities and powers." And I just heard this like in the last week, and I was like, "Oh, what? I know this phrase."
Yeah. And remember, principalities, princes. Daniel 10, Prince of Persia. It's the same thing.
Yep.
Goes right back to Psalm 82. You shall fall like men and die like any prince.
Any prince, right?
Well, and then there's that Bible verse that says, "Trust not in men, trust not in princes." Like it's all throughout. It's wonderful when you start to see the thread and you begin to pull it. Also, I will say that when my mom heard of the video game, The Prince of Persia, she said I couldn't play it because that was about
That's what I thought. I'm like, oh, did they come up with that cool idea based on Daniel? No.
No, it's just a time traveling guy. All right, so I think that's good. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been fun.
Oh yeah,
super nice to meet you. Thanks.
Send me the link when we're on, or when you've got the link for it.
Absolutely. I won't ask you the big question again since that was like a couple weeks ago, but I will ask you one unfortunate question, which is, do you believe that a hot dog is a sandwich?
No, I don't. I really don't.
I
don't think of it that way.
But I mean, is it a sandwich?
Rotate the shape in your head, man. What's a sandwich?
Technically, yeah. I would argue technically it is. I don't think of it as one. Like a sandwich would be like the Italian beef. I'm a Chicago guy, so if you're talking hot dogs, real hot dogs would be Chicago hot dogs, and Chicago hot dog places always also have Italian beef. And you do think of the Italian beef as a sandwich, but it's technically I think it's a good argument to say that it's a sandwich.
Well, a Chicago dog is a biblically accurate hot dog.
Yes, there are no other hot dogs. Actually,
there is no other hot dog.
No,
it's
there is only one.
All right. So with that, Merry Christmas, Brian. Thank you for coming on, and also thank you for your books. I've really enjoyed them.
I'm very pleased and honored to hear that. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to keep listening, and you're going to get occasional like messages.
Keep in touch.
When I hit places. So thank you so much. Like he said, you can find all of his stuff at Godawa.com. He's on Twitter at Brian Godawa. Most of the stuff that he said, most of the stuff he does is on Facebook. So you'll probably see a little bit more on his Facebook page. Is there anywhere else I need to point them? Obviously, Amazon in the description. Yeah. But yeah.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you next time.
You bet.
See you.
Till next time. Till we meet again. Bye.
Bye. All right. We did it. Guys, we did it. Do you have any questions for me, Whip?
I literally just meant that by biblically accurate, I meant that a Chicago dog was an abomination to look at.
Oh, you mean it's an Old Testament dog?
It's just like 1,000 eyes. Who knows what's in that thing?
Oh my Lord.
Oh my Lord. Bless my heart.
Well, yeah. So thank you guys for joining me. I love you
Pleasure.
both.
Ditto.
And
Been a good time.
Good to see you again, Zach.
I got a yo-yo
Same, brother.
just to be more like my buddy Zach. But oh,
we're going around the world. We're gonna walk this dog, baby.
So while I say the rest of this stuff, we're gonna let Zach yo-yo. So I'm gonna tell you the last two shows before Christmas. I'll tell you about New Year's. It's just gonna be part 2. But next week we're gonna have Mike Jones. I kind of want you to come on, Zach, because I know
you go.
You have ish. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Did you hear what I said?
No. I heard you. Yeah.
So next week we're having Mike Jones, aka Inspiring Philosophy, on. He is an interesting guy on TikTok. Sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I don't. But one of the things that has actually interested me is there are a lot of people, both pagan, atheist, and Torah observant, the unholy trinity, who will tell you that celebrating Christmas is evil, and that you shouldn't do it, and it's paganism and all of that. And there are all of these things that people say are facts about how it's actually pagan, and almost 0% of it is true. He has been waging a fight against a guy named Jim Staley, who made a documentary on it. I watched the first 20 minutes of that documentary the other day, Whip, and I wanted to die because his understanding of Babylonian cosmology and all of that was so bad. It was like, this is not what the Enuma Elish says. Shut up. But he's been trying to dismantle that, and so we're good. That's the last regular deep show before Christmas, and then we're gonna have our little Christmas party. Anyone who's been on this show is invited. Any fans who want to read something for it, and I can play it during the show, feel free to do that. We're gonna hang out. We're gonna celebrate. And then, that's it. Beyond that, if you want a Christmas shirt, mug, etc., wearethemadOnes.com/Christmas. If you want a regular shirt, it all goes to the same place. I just made a catchy thing for it to forward to. But I have brand new shirts that I made last night based on the imagery of the slain lamb from Revelation 5, which is some of my favorite imagery that no one gets. In fact, I was talking to a friend. I showed him the shirt last night, and he was like, "Man, that looks demonic." And I'm like, that's an image of Christ. But if you go to weirdmadones.com/store, you can get that. You can get the Cairo. You can get the Binkley Harless 2024 stuff. You can get, what's the other thing? The Black Tank, all of the stuff that I make, weirdmadones.com/store. If you'd like to support me in any way, one of the best ways you can do that is Patreon. The best way is to subscribe, like, and share the episodes, because if we hit certain amount of watch hours, boom, I can make money on this dumb site. But patreon.com/themadOnes for direct link to that. I'm on Twitter at HamCarlos. Whip is on Twitter at RealWhipSpoon. Zach is now newly on Twitter at The Muted Flag. He's also on TikTok.
You finally got me. I blame Cam. It's all your fault.
You're gonna see the worst.
I brought the Hallelujah Hulk into it, and he was like, "Yes, that's what I want to do." And it was all your fault. And now I had to make one because he made one. It is all your fault. Can't believe you. Anyway,
he's also on TikTok. Just search for The Muted Flag there.
Muted Flag.
If you're listening, you can watch weekly live on YouTube at youtube.com/themadOnes. You could also watch later because I'm lazy this week on rockfin.com and on Rumble, most places, if you want to watch. If you would rather listen and not see my face, I understand. And you can go to weirdthemadOnes.com and you can listen to it directly there, or any podcatcher that you like. That's it. That's all I've got. Anything you wonderful gentlemen want to say to the world before I hit the buttons?
God is good.
He is.
all the time.
He is. Thank you guys so much. And the rest of you, you have a chance to be a light in the world. So go light it up.